Sometimes in the kind of work that we do, the questions of God and suffering comes up so often. I think that in our cases, and I don't know how this phrase for when, people in the ministry, but sometimes we have more questions than answers, and we have to be okay with that.
Welcome to Unlikely Gifts, a podcast for anyone looking for hope amid difficult circumstances. Life can be beautiful, unexpected, and at times profoundly difficult. It helps to hear from others who have grown from life's challenges and joys. That's why Leonard Mbonani and Cynthia Bauer are sharing how their experiences working with families impacted by disabilities in Africa have taught them about life's most amazing gifts and its hardest tragedies. These are Unlikely Gifts.
Hello and welcome back to Unlikely Gifts. I'm Frank Boswell, and I'm joined by Cynthia Bauer and Leonard Mbonani, the co-founders and directors of Kupenda for the Children, an organization that works to replace harmful beliefs surrounding disability to those that improve lives. Kupenda is a Swahili word for love. That's what they do. And last time we got together, we talked about the topic of suffering, something that both of you know very well. And not just because of your work with people with disabilities, but also in your own personal lives. And if I could just summarize what I remember from that just two big takeaways for me. One, nobody gets a free pass. Everybody suffers. But the most intriguing thing to me was that people in America are surprised by that. People in Kenya aren't surprised by that. Most people around the world aren't as surprised as we are. And the second takeaway was that we need to move towards suffering. Our whole tendency, is to avoid it, but we need to engage it and come alongside suffering people. And when we do, we have the courage to engage that way, there are unlikely gifts that occur in our lives. And beauty can even emerge in some unexpected ways. So I was very touched when I listened to you two talk. You don't just talk in the abstract about disabilities or people with disabilities. You use names. You remember people going back years, specific individuals. I find that very touching. And I wondered if there were particular stories that you could share that illustrate some of the kinds of sufferings that you've encountered in your work.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, at least, to go first. Indeed, the work we do is full of suffering. And I remember two stories that really made me also to suffer. I remember there was a boy who is late by the name Shehe Kizao. Shehe Kizao was a child who became very close to me because he joined a special school. Then with a short time, it's like the parents found that the distance was too long. So they asked me to look for an alternative school placement. And in the process of looking for that school placement, I happened to visit his home, looking for his mother for a further discussion. And I remember that day when I reached the home, as I had finished greeting this boy, he gave me an assignment. Which I remember he said, "Leonard, you are delaying me from joining school. Can you be faster so that I can join school?" And I left that home with those words that this boy really wants to go to school. I went looking for the mother from different places. When I reached one of the homes, I was told, "No, she's not in this home, check in the other home." And I did the same until I found the mother. Then after a discussion, we agreed that Shehe should go to Marafa Special School, which was a bit near to this boy. And that is exactly what we did. But after a short period, I remember Shehe became sick. I'm not very sure what was wrong with him, but only later to learn that he had passed on and I had been invited to attend the burial of this young boy. I remember very well the staff or teachers for Marafa Special were there and other community members. And then I was given an opportunity to say a word during the burial of this young boy. Then I recalled all the sufferings that this boy had gone through, particularly with his sickness, also looking for school placement and so on. So when I was given the microphone, I couldn't talk. I started crying. Just look, a boy who had really been close to me, a boy who had even assigned me some work to find an alternative school for him. Today, I have managed to give him that alternative, and he's gone. I remember crying just like any other person who was hurt by the death of this young man. Up to today, though it's many years, but I have never forgotten this young man, and he has taught me something that, okay, suffering is for everybody on this world, because he already had a disability. Still, he went through a lot of health problems, and finally, he even made me to shed my tears during his burial ceremony. He lives in my mind forever, and whenever I look at that, I remember that story of this boy. It's like, oh yes, people with disabilities are suffering. On top of their disabilities, they still have other health issues that will also make them suffer.
What makes him stand out amongst all the people that you've known?
Well, what I have come to realize, and I'm giving my personal experience, then I connect it to this young man. My personal experience is that we were born, three of us, three boys. But when I asked my mother, is that I had more health challenges when I was young. And as I grew up, she became so attached to me. And I wanted to find out why. And she said, it's because you gave me a lot of health issues that I was always in the hospital to the traditional healer. And because of those problems, it makes me to be more attached to you. Now, I want to bring this story to Shehe, because Shehe had always been making a follow-up to make sure Shehe is school. It is not even 3 times, 4 times, going to his home, trying to make sure that I convince the parents to take Shehe to school. And even when he's in school, when he breaks for holiday, he will always be late to be brought to school. I had to make a follow-up. So it's like that process of always being close to him as I make a follow-up made me to have a very close attachment to this young man. And that is why, though I have attended several burials of such children, to him it was unique because of how I had really come out to assist him, and then here he dies.
You had to really invest in him in a big way. Well, it's interesting that I mean, who can understand how a life can be cut short like that? And yet he kind of lives on in a way, in the way he's affected you. And even in this moment, as you share that story, it's a great story. How about you, Cindy?
The thing that's interesting is most of the individuals I know through Leonard. I do get to be in the field sometimes, not as much as I used to be. Well, I think, one of the mothers that recently affected me while I was in Kenya, it was one of the moms and how she was suffering. Because what happens in these situations is disability, as you know, affects the whole family. It's not just the individual. And oftentimes the mothers we work with, they just really, really love their kids and they suffer on their behalf. And they end up being alienated from the community because of it as well. And I just remember this one woman, and in this case, I could feel the relief of her suffering in her statement, if you understand that. She was talking about how much of a difference it had made for her that she had been connected to a parent support group. That's a group of other parents of kids with disabilities that our community leaders, like pastors and traditional healers and so on, that come through our programs, help to organize. And then these parents actually have a place to actually find comfort and solace in people who know what their experiences are like, a safe place to share their own stories. And this woman said that before she had connected to this group, she wanted to take her own life. And she had 2 children that both had microcephaly, which is a small head. And her husband had left her. She was a single mom. She's like, I can't work. People are telling me I should get rid of my children, that I should kill them. And I didn't know what to do. She's like, but it wasn't until I had this group that I actually had hope. And these same people that were in her community that once told her to kill her children were now actually helping her to take care of them so she could actually get a job. And so I think I felt the pain more in the past tense. She wasn't in it at the moment, but just like the relief that she had having gone through that. And we have and they're just the examples that we mentioned are just representatives of many. There's sometimes, I'm not so sure sometimes how much to share of the ones that affected me the most because they're so incredibly dark. So because we have situations of children that are in wheelchairs that can't speak, that are raped. We have children that have died alone. Those are the kind of suffering I think sometimes that most bothers me is the children that we have known of that were found by themselves after they had died, meaning they died alone. And that really bothers me. We could give you more details of those stories, but that might be too dark for this particular situation. I'm not sure.
Wow. Is this customary for the neighbors to come around and tell you to kill your child?
Yeah, it depends on the type or the severity of the disability. In many cases, those who have severe disabilities, they have been advised by the neighbors, even family members, that you should kill this child. How are you going to take care of this child? He looks totally different from the rest of the family members. And it needs a mother who is very strong to resist that ideas from the neighborhood or from the family members. But if she accepts, there are women who can really be bad and can even help in terminating the life of a child.
People will even add to it at the funerals of their children. There have been, just in this last year, pastors who at the funerals of these children will tell the parents that it was their fault that their child died. So they're piling suffering on to people who are already suffering, saying that they didn't have enough faith or something like that. But in defense of Kenyan culture and other cultures like that, when we talk about people eliminating children, I always make sure when I'm in Kenya, I explain that we do the same things. We just have better technology to do it in America. So for some of the disabilities like spina bifida or things you can tell before birth, I think that we do the same things, maybe for different reasons.
I would not hold us up as a child valuing culture by any means. There's very dark things that go on, but it is much more cosmetized and out of sight. I'm curious about another thing. You said that the very people that encouraged her to kill her child were the ones that come around now and help her. Can you talk more about that change? What on earth changed their attitudes?
I'll say a little bit, but Leonard should really fill in more of that. Is what happens is when these families come together and they support one another, they also, one of the things Leonard does is, and the whole team, we encourage them to become advocates. So we don't, because sometimes when you go through a lot, you might think, a lot of people I've heard say, well, once I get through this, then I'll be able to help others. Ours is like, no, you start helping others now. Like you are an advocate to help other families of other people in the community. So these parents get the strength and numbers to actually advocate for their kids' rights within their community. So they're also changing the mindsets of the community members around them. So the very same people, she was given the strength and with the other people supporting her to change their mindsets.
Well, one of the things you said is that suffering raises questions about God. And I wonder what place do religious assumptions and beliefs play in suffering?
I think that it was C.S. Lewis who said in A Grief Observed, he said, it seems like at those moments when you need God the most, he slams the door in your face and locks it on the other side. And I think that's a feeling that can be surprising to people in their lowest moments. It doesn't, I mean, I think it's hard to know, it's just a feeling. I think that when we're going through things that are really hard, it can often feel like God is absent. And I think that the opposite also happens for people in certain times, that during suffering, they feel God closer to them. But I'm not really sure why it goes both directions, I think, for many people. I asked Leonard a long time ago, I said, why do you think it is? It seems to me that in the communities that we work with of lower income people, people who don't always know where their next meal is going to come from, and people who you would consider to be suffering more than others, why they seem to have a stronger faith than a lot of the people I encounter who don't have that kind of suffering. And Leonard gave me a good answer that I think Leonard should answer for himself instead of me saying it, but I'm not sure. Or maybe just you could answer it freely now. I mean, you could ask the question again, like, do you think it's true that many of the people who are suffering have a stronger faith than those who don't? And if so, why?
Thank you. I want to respond by saying people who come from very low income have gone through a lot of suffering, maybe right from the time they were born. They were brought up in families where they could not meet their basic needs. They could see many people suffer, and there is no maybe immediate treatment available. So as they grow, they become so resistant to many of the sufferings, such that we could say resilience. They build a lot of resilience, such that these are people who will always, whenever they get a problem, they believe, surely this is a problem which I can handle, I can move ahead and serve my child or my family. I know it's challenging, but because this person is used to all these problems, he becomes so resistant. He has that zeal of making sure he finds a solution to that problem, as opposed to somebody who is wealthy enough. He can access medication, he can access food anytime he wants. So you find that when a problem hits this family, which is a bit well off, it destroys them completely. But here, this person who has gone through all those challenges from young age all the way to maybe to adult or even to a grandmother, they really know how to resist under such difficult circumstances. For instance, when you look at what is happening in our country, where the cost of living has become very high, I believe it's because Kenyans are so strong, they will always find a way of survival. Otherwise, if it was in other countries, maybe there would have been some demonstration as to why. Why are we suffering? Why is the whole nation suffering because of the cost of living? But I want to say, parents who have gone through all these challenges, right from childhood, end up developing a very high resistance to many challenges that they come across.
And how does it affect their faith, Leonard?
When it comes to their faith, here we have mixed reactions. You'll find at the beginning, these people may always be going for medication, trying to look for medication. But when they feel like something is not happening, they always say, yes, God gave me this child for a purpose, and I have to trust in Him. That's why you feel like, they strongly believe that I have a purpose of taking care of my child throughout, regardless of all the challenges that I'm going through. So you find that their faith becomes so strong as far as their child is concerned, particularly when they say, this is what God gave me and I should take care of this child. And it is very strong among the mothers, even than the parents. So the faith the mothers have is very strong, and it keeps on making them to continue serving their children with a disability, whether mild, severe, and so on. They are struggling, and they don't believe in other things. They say, a child is a child, and it's a blessing from God.
Well, that's a complete reversal from where we started, right? I mean, Kupenda started in part because people saw children with disabilities as being under a curse. And now you're telling me that they've completely reframed it and see this as some kind of gift that God has given them. Did I hear that? Is that a fair way to put that?
Yes, if you look at how parents were perceiving those children, particularly those parents who have been in our program, who have had us talk to them, they will always say, yes, I'm seeing the value of my child. He's a human being like any other. And that is why they make that statement. A child is a blessing.
And that changes the suffering then, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't eliminate the suffering, but it sounds to me like that would transform it would give some meaning to the suffering.
I actually think it's part of the suffering is that viewpoint. It's not necessarily having a disability that's the suffering. It's the way the community treats people that is the suffering. Like, I think that, we've had to be careful with language. Like, sometimes the language that some people would use, oh, this person suffers from cerebral palsy, this person suffers from Down syndrome. Like, no, they have those things. They may or may not suffer. The disability itself is not the suffering. It often is the way. And so and we'll talk about healing and later things, like we think that, they originally, the idea was that you heal people from these disabilities, you cure them or something, and that's where you eliminate the suffering. Or like, actually, when we work with communities and these are transformations of people and mindsets and acceptance and love and understanding their value, that's healing. And I think Johnny Erickson said it well after when people talk about her quadriplegia. And she said, honestly, it's a bigger miracle for me to be smiling from this wheelchair than if I should get up and walk. And I think that's true. And I think even just watching the overcoming of suffering, my brother and I were talking about this last summer, the first summer after he lost his daughter to a 4-year battle with cancer. And I'm just like, I think that they prayed for miracles for so long, and there's a lot of suffering in that. And my niece went through a lot of stuff, but she somehow could smile in the midst of the pain. Somehow in the midst of like being hooked up to all these IVs, she wanted to dance in the hospital room with me. And I think that now, the bigger miracle isn't so much that she was healed. It wouldn't have been that she was healed from cancer. I think it's a bigger miracle to live our lives without her. And so like finding the courage and the strength to actually find a way to live. And I think that sometimes in the kind of work that we do, the questions of God and suffering comes up so often. I think that in our cases, and I don't know how this phrase for people in the ministry, but sometimes we have more questions than answers, and we have to be okay with that. We know for sure we're supposed to come along suffering people. The rest, there's so many other things that are questions. I think that when it comes to the questions of why do people suffer, there's no real good answer, especially for a parent who's lost a child.
I know the German poet Rainer Rilke talks about living the questions. He says there aren't answers, so you need to live the questions, and he expounds on that at some length. And I found that to be a really intriguing and helpful thought.
Mm-hmm. I've heard a lot of people say, like, there's so many questions they have of God, and why are we suffering, and why this and not that they wish they could ask God. But then by the time you meet God face to face, you probably won't care about those questions anymore.
Well, that was Job's experience. Some things just don't lend themselves to nice little packages and neat propositional answers. But having said that, you come from a Christian perspective here. What do you think is different about the Christian way of suffering or the Christian understanding of suffering? Can you speak to that?
I think from my perspective, what a Christian should do to those who are suffering, to be honest, is to be close to those people. And I want to give an example. When I was going through chemo treatment with a lot of challenges, I was suffering. But I could see what my family members were doing to me. They were very close to me, supporting me, and wherever there is a need, and giving me a word of encouragement. I felt like I was not walking this journey alone, but I had the people who are with me. And this is the same thing I expect Christians to be doing to people who are suffering, to be closer to them, pray to them, provide it to them, and also be there to counsel them and even share quality time with these people. When we do that, I think even those who are suffering will afford a smile within the midst of his suffering, as opposed to leaving them all alone, blaming them for whatever is happening. That is not helpful at all.
You think that, I was going to say, in some ways, at least what I've experienced in Kenyan communities, because I live in a Christian culture, so it's hard to compare with other faiths. You can compare with no faith at all, I suppose. I've found that there's more similarities than differences when it comes to suffering, I think, of people knowing that God calls them to come alongside other people when they're truly following God, when they're truly seeking truth, if you will. I think that that's the truth they find, is that God wants us to come alongside suffering people. And that seems to be true in most major religions when they're doing it with an idea of seeking. And, I think that when people are seeking the truth, they will find God. And I've heard of people in other faiths understanding things about finding Jesus in those places. But I think that one thing I have found to be different, just from what I study other religions that I really appreciate about Christianity. I was talking with another pastor about this the other day. Not, theology aside, who's right aside, all that stuff. I think that one of the beautiful things I think of, what I have not found in other faith practices, is the grace part of Christianity. The grace. I think that I haven't found that in other faiths that I've known of, is that there is this place of saying, when people suffer, it's not anyone's fault. It's not like you're supposed to be punishing yourself for things you've done wrong. Like, there is actually grace and forgiveness in the midst of suffering, which I think is something that I find to be helpful. My experience is just seeing like that grace component. And if you really understand Jesus, you see that what some of the places practice is opposite of what Jesus says. Like, if you follow us, you will suffer. That's part of it. And that part is also true in at least the Muslim context, from what I understand, that suffering is also part of that, their faith.
I think there's beauty in all the religions, but there's not Jesus. I think he really is singular and stands apart. I mean, that's my conviction. And if he really is God, and this is who God is, I mean, it's pretty stunning to realize his attitude. But like the blind man and the disciples want to know who sinned. Did he sin or did his parents sin? Which completely misses the point. And Jesus addresses the problem. He doesn't have an academic discussion. That's kind of what I hear you saying. And
I think that
if the Christian way of being is one of faith, hope, and love, and you talked about engaging people because of their value and out of love, that seems to be pretty distinctive to me.
Well, and there was a man that I heard at one of a conference, some kind of webinar or something I was a part of, who worked for the World Bank. And he was talking about doing development with other faiths as a Christian. And one of the things he said is he looked around this room, gathered from people from all over the world that were doing the hard work of working with people in the most impoverished, difficult situations on the planet. And all these different people from different faiths were doing it because of their faith. And he said, again, who's right or wrong at the end of the day? He's like, I put that aside. He's like, we're all coming for the same reason. And that is out of a love that God has instilled in us to support the least of these. He's like, and I think that makes God smile. And I think that, I think that we're coming together, and we do that often too. It's really I remember seeing at a workshop pastors working with Muslim parents, and how they work together in partnership. And it wasn't in a way that somehow they were able to do that without that religious divide being a factor. Because we've also noticed that disability is a uniting factor. It actually breaks down barriers. So a mother who's from a Muslim background and a mother of the Christian background, they both have a very strong faith, and they have a child with a similar disability, that thing that might have divided them before no longer does because of their mutual experiences of just disability.
Thank you. I think a lot of people wonder, well, what do you say to a suffering person? Are there things that you have found helpful, constructive to say, or conversely to not say when you're dealing with people who are really suffering?
We can say a lot of things. There's such a long list of what not to say. Sometimes it's to not say anything, I think. And I know that you've also dealt with these situations yourself as a pastor. Like, I think I personally find I think I always feel like put yourself in the other end, because all of us have experienced suffering. And so when we're in it, what has helped us and what has not helped us? And that's going to be true for the other people as well. And like when you're in that situation, I think the thing that I've read before that's the best is like, I'm really sorry you're going through this. Can I do your laundry? Can I come and help get you food during this particular time of, say, that they're going through? Making practical things and saying, I will listen. I'm here for anything you have to say. And I think it's also not judging, because I think, like you said before, suffering can affect people's faith, and to give them the freedom in that moment to say things that you don't agree with, that you might struggle with, but that's not the time. It's not the time for that. Sometimes people just need to say things. What do you think, Leonard?
I think what is most important to people who are going through suffering, be it the person himself or herself or the family, I think the most important thing they need from us is the support. The support talks volumes than any other words you are going to be giving. But when you are there to help them, as Cynthia has saying, like helping to wash their clothes, providing their food, being there at least to share time with them, or being there even to assist in getting medication, all those things that you are giving direct support, or even is staying together, make more sense or are very helpful to somebody going through suffering. Sometimes I have had a challenge where maybe you are talking about the cause of the disability. I think sometimes this could be something that generates a very difficult discussion, because I'm looking at most of our parents are people who never went to school. They may not understand all those explanations as what caused the disability and what he or she should expect. But I think what they understand, or what they need the most, is just you being there, supporting them in all their basic needs and even in the medication. That makes a big sense to people who are going through suffering.
And I've also found when people ask the question, why, I think people often in the midst of something, why would God allow this? Why would God cause this? However people want to phrase it. At the end of the day, I'm like, I don't know. At the end, I just know this world is broken, and suffering is a part of that. And all we can do is come alongside and try to make the burden a little less for you. And I'll never, like Leonard and I had a conversation recently where Leonard got kind of emotional, right? When I said, I can't tell you your cancer's not going to come back. I'll never say that because I don't know. But I can tell you that we will be there every step of the way to make sure you get every treatment and support during that time. So I think that it's just for people to be reminded, and, you know, friends that are going through us, like you can never, like I've had friends recently worried that there's a possibility they could lose more than one family member at one time or something like that. They're like, I can't tell you it's not going to happen, but I can tell you about people who've gone through hard situations that have survived and come out on the other side. A friend of mine, maybe a couple years after I lost my dad, he had just lost his mom. And I just said, all I know, and I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, is the feeling you might have right now doesn't last forever. It actually does become more manageable down the road. I'm not saying the feeling and the missing the person goes away, but life becomes more able, you become more able to manage life, or I was able to manage life better. So what feels so dark and heavy now is likely not to be this way forever.
I was going to ask you how doing this work has affected your own suffering or change your understanding or approach to suffering?
It changes your perspective for sure. Like one of the things that I noticed, I think probably, I know I brought it up a lot because losing a child, I think, is the worst kind of suffering. And in my family, losing my niece, there's so many questions that come up and you see people's responses in the United States. And again, mostly from people in the church community. I felt people like to silver line things somehow, silver line the suffering. And not just say the whole thing of well, she's in heaven now. I'm like, okay, but she's not here. That it doesn't really make me, I mean, yes, that can, I think that sometimes trying to silver line things almost tries to make people feel like they can't be sad. Because sometimes we just need to be sad. And I think people need to let us be sad and let us grieve. I actually had written a song on my niece's first birthday afterwards that said that. People want to silver line it and say, oh, she's here, she was taken by the angels. And yeah, sure. But I think, and maybe it does have a tiny bit of improvement, but it's also more I think people are just really uncomfortable when they see people suffering, that they want to make it feel like it couldn't happen to them, or it couldn't, there has to be something good about it, or there's a lesson you're learning that maybe I don't have to learn, or something like that. I don't know. And for us, it is sometimes, I think it gives us perspective, but also I think that just shows us that whatever we're going through, like Leonard said, when, as in his dealing with cancer himself, we know it's not just us. And there's something about that, because I think that suffering can be an isolating feeling. Leonard?
Yeah, you are very right, Cindy. I think when you see people going through a lot of suffering, you get a deeper understanding, and your perception about suffering changes. And I want to say, when I was starting working with children with disabilities, when I came across one who is in severe pain because of the disability, I always felt my heart was broken. But with time, I came to realize, yes, it's not a matter of looking at how much this person is going through pain. It's a matter of saying, how can I support this person? So today, anytime I come across somebody with a disability going through suffering, my mind goes back very fast to think of how can I help him to overcome, or at least to reduce the suffering that he is going through. So quickly, I'm thinking of the ways to support this family. And again, one thing I've also learned is that as you work with people who are going through suffering, should the suffering come to you, I think it helps you to understand that, yes, there are many people who are suffering, but they are still surviving and they are going on with their work regardless of all the suffering that they are going through. And sometimes I have always been referring to some children I know they are totally in wheelchairs throughout their lives, but they are still doing their work. They are still in school, pursuing their education, struggling to push themselves from one corner to the other in their wheelchairs. And I ask myself, yes, they are suffering, but life has to continue. So as Leonard, I'm suffering, but I still have to continue doing what I'm supposed to do.
And actually it helps. I've learned, I think for Leonard too, when you come alongside other suffering people, I think we've learned that actually helps us to alleviate our own as well. I heard someone once say that, so was saying, what do? I just can't get out of this feeling. I'm suffering so much. And the thing is, the only thing the person could say as advice was, find someone else who's suffering and come alongside them and support them. That's actually one of the few ways in the midst of it that sometimes that burden can be lessened.
And also we are serving as a source of encouragement to other people. I remember another person who came and saw me when I was sick. And then after a while, he found me working in the office. Then he said, hey, if Leonard, under such a situation, is in the office serving children with a disability, why not me? Okay, I'm going through suffering, but I still feel like I can also continue with my work. And this guy was a doctor, I think, Cindy, Dr. Jengo. He came and confessed. When I see you, Leonard, work under such healthy condition, it encourages me also to continue working regardless of whatever I am going through. So I appear in my office as a doctor. I serve the patients. At the same time, I have a problem myself, which needs some medication. But that should not stop me from serving the rest. And you are a source of encouragement to me.
Well, and when I saw Leonard, not this year, but the year before, when we both thought it might be our last time to see one another, because Leonard was really, really unwell. It was amazing in our conversation. Leonard, when I first saw him, I'm like, oh, Leonard really is done. Just by the look of it, I'm like, he's done. I'm not going to see him again. But in that conversation, within an hour, he started talking about the work. He started talking about his vision for the kids and the families we work with. And he started to come alive again. It was so amazing to watch in the moment Leonard actually have come alive because of that need to keep going. Because of
the big unlikely gift here is that our suffering is our greatest point of contact with other people. And the if I could say, the Christian way of suffering is to engage with the suffering of other people. That's certainly what Jesus did. And you look good, by the way, Leonard. you look, whatever you're doing, you look great.
Thank you.
Well, let me ask you one other question before we wrap up. You had mentioned, Cindy, books on suffering, yet you've read a lot of different books. Are there certain ones that stand out that you think are helpful for people?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I know it's old and it's C.S. Lewis, but I really appreciate A Grief Observed. One of the things I liked about it, because I've noticed even when people share a testimony of suffering, when I've heard it sometimes at churches or some experience they've had that was difficult, they always tend to wrap it up in a pretty bow at the end. And now everything is fine. I'm like, that isn't, I mean, you still have more life to go. More stuff is bound to happen.
Sort of like Christian virtue signaling. It's like they're obligated to, have a Hallmark ending, but it's not like that.
Yeah, I mean, I one day want to see a Hallmark movie that ends where they just decide, no, we're not getting married after all. But anyway, or where someone chooses their career over marriage or something instead. But I think I like A Grief Observed, even though it's dark, but it's more of that. Like, I think it's like reading Ecclesiastes when you're going through suffering. It doesn't necessarily make you feel hopeful that everything's going to be fine, but it does tell you you're not alone. If you wonder about other suffering people, if they're going through it, just read the Bible too. There's other people going through the same. And I really like a lot of things written by Phillip Yancey. Phillip Yancey wrote the book I liked. I think it was called "Where Is God When It Hurts." That was it.
Yes, that's it.
I really like that one. And I think Phillip Yancey, again, doesn't have like the pretty package answers. He does talk about the pretty package answers that people give you often when you're suffering that don't help. Like, oh, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. And they're like, well, I wish God didn't trust me so much then. Or like, God doesn't, or this is happening to teach you something, because it can go both extremes. Like the suffering is happening because you're such a great person and such a great Christian, or the suffering's happening because you're not Christian enough, you're not faithful enough, you need to learn a lesson. Like, neither extreme is great. You're kind of like, I remember saying sarcastic things when I've gone through difficult times. Like, maybe I should just go, like, I don't know, just start doing some kind of terrible job so God leaves me alone. Like the idea that people would say, because of the work you're doing, you're getting attacked more. Whether that's true, it's not helpful in the midst of all of that kind of stuff. But I think, Philip, those were a couple of the books that I have liked when it comes to that particular subject, because it's not cheesy. I think cheesy just doesn't help in our situations. I don't know, Leonard, if you've read many books on suffering itself. Have you?
Not really. I've not had the opportunity to read many books, but maybe to say something about suffering. And this is after an observation. When you have a friend, like I have a friend I have known for many years, and this friend is going through a lot of suffering in one way or the other. But what I've realized is that the most important thing when this friend of mine is talking to me, I need to give this friend all the attention. and I allow him to or her to say everything that he has. And by the time we are parting, you will find that at least this person has had a word of encouragement. One, by pouring out all that is in the heart, and also you paying a lot of attention up to the time he or she finishes narrating the entire story that is in him or her.
I wanted to point out one thing before we finish, is I don't know, I'm really into definitions, and I realize we never exactly define suffering. And I'm like, oh, there is a definition of that. And it's interesting, some of the definitions. But one of them was actually suffering implies a conscious endurance of pain or distress, which I thought that was interesting. And it's because I think there was a question in your questions ahead of time that you had sent us that said, does everyone suffer equally? And one thing I noticed is that two people can be in the exact same situation, but only one of them is suffering. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, there can be people that are maybe, experiencing similar things. And the takeaway is that one of them suffers, the other doesn't to the same degree. And there are some people who have way more on their plate. I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday. I was thinking about this podcast coming up. You think about, there are celebrities who are beautiful and talented and wealthy, and they take their own lives. They're suffering so much that they take their own lives. And yet you have someone in the midst of the poorest area of Africa who is not able to walk, who is experiencing condemnation from other people, blaming them for their own disabilities. Yet they push on and they live and they go forward. And why is it that one person, and both of them are in very different situations, but the one suffering is the one actually in the better circumstance because they took their own life? And I don't know that, it's just as a thought that I had, like, suffering is not necessarily the experiences, even though some people have worse experiences that would cause more suffering, but some people don't seem to have those, or at least from the outside, and yet they suffer.
Well, you guys dance on the edge of mystery every day. I mean, that is really mysterious. That's a really interesting note on which to land. And I guess the other mystery here is the whole issue of healing, which I know we want to talk about. God uses healing. People suffer, but there is such a thing as healing, but not everybody's healed. That's one of those mysteries that I guess we'll explore next time. But for today, I want to thank you both for opening your hearts and sharing your thoughts with the listeners. I know I'm always really moved and challenged by your insights, and I thank you for them. And I wish you well until we're able to meet again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We hope this episode of An Unlikely Gift has been a source of hope to you as you walk through all of life's challenges and joys. If you'd like to be a part of the meaningful work Kupenda is doing, please visit our website at www.kupenda.org. That's Kupenda. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us next week as we explore the topic of healing.